Let's do it. So first of all, for everyone on the webinar today, thank you so much for joining us. I guess I'll kind of get this out of the way up front, as I'm sure it'll come up in the Q&A. This webinar is being recorded and we'll absolutely be sharing the deck as well as the recording later today. So if you need to jump out halfway through, no worries. But to kick off some of the content, my name is Troy Rowell. I'm joined here by Mike Black, CMO at Profitero. And today we'll be talking about a tale of two recoveries and how to win in the hybrid return and really what that means. So Mike, I kind of took some air out of that introduction there, but as I mentioned, CMO Mike Black at Profitero. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Troy. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for getting my back here. To jump into the agenda, really what we're going to be doing and covering, or I should say, is number one, back to school trends. And the reason why we're looking at that is this is really the first kind of holiday period or indication of what this hybrid model really looks like, and ultimately what it means and what the implications are for Q4. So we'll be setting the stage here, going over some data, and then really a bulk of the webinar today will be Mike and I discussing and sharing some of the strategies to win not only digital shelf, but also retail media in Q4. And then of course, we'll open it up at the end for any Q&A. Alrighty, and for those of you that may have been driven here from our lovely friends over at Profitero to share a little bit more about Pacvue. Pacvue is an e-commerce advertising, automation, and analytics platform, adopting APIs across retailers and retailer networks such as Amazon, Walmart, Instacart, Criteo, and more, in order to help brands, sellers, and agencies unify different e-commerce ecosystems and drive actionable results through the aforementioned advertising and reporting automation.
Yeah, and Profitero we're an e-commerce analytics platform that really specializes in measuring and optimizing the digital shelf, which we describe as really everything that the consumer can see when they go through their path to purchase on an e-commerce site, from in-stock availability to pricing to content to search position organically. And we do this and we monitor this data across 600 retailers worldwide, including Amazon. So
right,
one of the things, yeah.
Yeah,
no problem. So one of the things, as Troy said, we wanted to dig into was back to school, because we think what we're seeing in back to school is indicative of some new behaviors, but also a really good indicator of what's to come as we head into the Q4 and holiday season. So, starting with the very first trend that we're seeing is earlier than normal in back to school. We saw very strong demand across a lot of the categories that were not being purchased last year. Most specifically, backpacks really took off early. And when I say early, typically we would see back to school purchasing maybe happening in a mid-July to like an August framework, but we saw that really starting to build at the end of June and early July. And what was interesting about that is that really it was almost like a return to normal in some ways, where parents were going in and we started to see people accepting that school would be coming back in a very physical way. And I think we also saw those trends, if you've been tracking the earnings reports for retailers from Walmart and Target that they just came up with recently, is that they've been seeing that in their sales data. So something to be looking for, as we'll see, that Troy will show, is that purchasing demand is moving much earlier in seasons, and something to think about in Q4.
Absolutely, you nailed it. And I think maybe some of the folks on the attendee list want to kind of cover their ears here, but really what we're seeing is, based on some of the consumer search trends, is seasonal shopping is becoming earlier and earlier, right? That might be a nightmare scenario for some folks, but ultimately what this means is, from a marketing standpoint, right, get your ducks in a line earlier than ever before. But also as a shopper, to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit, this means that if there are times where you're typically more familiar with whether it's online or even in store, buying, let's say, holiday gifts, for example, I think what we're predicting and what we'll be looking at here in the next couple slides is that the digital and physical shelves are going to look much different during some of these key periods.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we saw, and this is data from Nielsen that was just put out a couple of days ago, is that a lot of the categories, specifically in back to school, are being purchased more regularly online. And so comparing pre-COVID sales and share online versus now, if you look at things like lunch bags, salty snacks, for this back to school, we saw a pretty significant spike in that purchasing, which is sort of interesting because these are things that you would expect in kind of return to normal situation. People would be going back to stores, but it isn't. We are really seeing the omni-channel behavior continue. And what's also interesting about this is Nielsen has been looking at this quite a bit, and the omni shopper really is representing even more sales. So they've found that, looking back at 2020, when there was a lot of this omni shopping behavior driving, that omni shoppers, with kids spent 17% more than without. So, there's been a lot of discussion about what does it mean now the stores are opening up in terms of online. And I think what it really is saying is that there is no one mode, that really, as we head into Q4, we're going to see this multimodal shopping continue, which means that the monitoring the digital shelf and optimizing your strategies on it is just going to be equal as doing things physically. And we have to be all in all places that consumers are going to be looking. The other thing, and this is not, I'm not breaking any news here, but we got supply, there's a lot of issues happening in the supply chain. And we're going to really focus on what we think are actionable strategies later on this. But one of the things that we did around the first week of August, we did a pulse survey of consumers, and we had already found that by the time of August, which is still not even peak back to school shopping for many parts of the country, 61% of consumers who started their shopping had already really run into out of stock issues. Backpacks are a really good example. So it's definitely, the kind of flip side of shopping early. We see the motivations. Yes, people are shopping earlier because they're getting smarter and smarter in knowing that the supply out there is limited. And that's why we're seeing this behavior drive. So this trend sort of supports the trend that we're seeing with the earlier shopping in the season period.
Right. And I think it's not only the trends, right? I mean, unfortunately, there's kind of other external factors that are contributing to some of this inflation that we're speaking of. I think just as recently, I read one of the articles that I believe is posted here around CNN, kind of detailing some of the things around, what they're calling the shipping crisis. Essentially, a vast network of ports, container vessels, trucking companies that move goods around the world is bottlenecked, right? This means that the cost of shipping is going up. But in the reality, rising cost of shipping, unfortunately, is just one example of increased costs that consumer goods companies are having to deal with. What this means as a consumer is these costs are essentially being passed on to them in order to try and maintain the bottom line, right? So from a marketing standpoint, this indicates that inventory issues may be even worse this Q4 than what we saw last year. So the point being here is you need to have a contingency plan in place. As Mike mentioned, we're going to be talking about more tactical things here as hopefully my first and last kind of shameless Pacvue plug here. Pacvue can help automate bidding strategies around inventory, right? All that's to say is outside of some of the strategies we're speaking of, make sure you have the technology in place to address some of the challenges that we're facing in today's day and age.
Yeah, and the kind of result of this shipping, or part of it, is inflation. So one of the things that we do at Profitero is that we monitor monthly. We have this thing called the e-commerce price index, sort of our version of the U.S. labor's pricing index. One of the things that was interesting about back to school was that if you look at year over year, roughly between June 2020 and July 2021, pretty significant increases in what consumers were paying for things that they would normally buy for back to school. So consumers are feeling it, but behind that also is the cost that manufacturers are facing, right? What we don't know where those trends are going, but I think it's fairly safe to assume that if supply issues continue to do what they do, then we're going to see those costs get up. And really, it's interesting that if you look at the numbers on the right, actually, if you started shopping in June and then shopped in July, you would have paid more for back to school items in July than in June. So again, early bird is not only getting the worm when it comes to supply, but early bird is getting the best price. And this is all driving that earlier shopping behavior. And the other aspect here is what we're counseling brands to do is more than ever having awareness of where these trends are going to be really important. And I'll give you an example is we're hearing a lot from brands about, that classic debate. Do we pass price increases on? Do we pass it? Do we do it? And I actually feel like we're at a moment where if you look at this data and you look at your category, that's already happening. The question is like, are you late to the game? And there could be a real opportunity with having data and trends like this to build a really compelling story to retailers that, hey, you should be getting these price increases too. So as you're looking into the holiday, number one, it's a good time to take an assessment of pricing trends. Are you going to be going into the season price at the place you want to be? Is there opportunity to take price? Is there opportunity to pull other levers so that you can make sure that you are actually reducing your costs as you go? And we'll talk a little bit about some other competitive monitoring things that you could be doing too as well.
Yeah, and to take a look at some of the trends, I guess we've seen kind of back in July by Profitero and other great use of resource here, just looking at consumer search trends. Really what we saw year over year in July, and this was somewhat of a more kind of optimistic study here, are some of those product categories that were previously neglected in July of 2020 actually saw somewhat of a resurgence, right? Some of the more obvious ones such as apparel, beauty, but when you begin to look at it a little bit further, even things like grab and go foods, right? People are going back to the office. This is what we're seeing. So no time to be able to make that breakfast at home anymore. Got to get that food on the go. And then even something a little bit further, which I hadn't even thought about until I saw this lovely study here by Profitero, is looking out for loved ones, right? So everyone knows someone that got a pandemic pet, I'll call them for lack of a better term, and now having to buy some products here that maybe they didn't think about prior. How am I going to take care of that cat or that dog now that I am having to go back to the office, as an example? Security cameras also saw an uptick. So I think, again, consumer search trends are really going to be indicative of the way that shopping behavior is changing. And for better or worse, right, this is not a new insight here, but really the way that the Delta variant and coronavirus will continue to develop will really kind of drive which products are seeing surges, whether that's predictable or not.
Yeah, and I love the Furbo one because you could actually flip treats out to your pet while you're watching them.
Yeah, and then here, of course, this one isn't as kind of surprising, right? But even with people kind of going back, I think the point here is health and personal care is certainly here to stay. So, Mike, I don't know if you want to kind of add anything else here, but the point being is these product categories are going to continue to grow.
Yeah, no, yeah. So it's like one of the, we look, I think generally across the, across these categories, it's going to be a mixed bag in terms of what happens, but cold and flu was one of those categories, which, if you look back in October, November, every year is always a big category. It wasn't really the case last year. Now people are coming out and, at different parts, and we're starting to see these almost these blips of trends, whether we fully go back to work or not. It's more than ever, you need to pay attention to it. And actually, if you go to the next slide, Nielsen had an article that they did a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was really, really smart. Basically, the idea is like there is no uniform return to normal, right? We're all looking for that point of the flipping where we get back, and how do we forecast in this world? And the truth is, it's really difficult because there are really three modes that we see consumers operating in. You can go to different parts of the country, you go to different places in your town, and you're going to have people that are really comfortable going out. Those are the people that are getting pampered up. Those are the people that are getting out there, and now you're going to see some of that demand coming from those cohorts of people. Whereas you're going to see people in the middle who are much more cautious, and then you're going to see, the concerned. And so it's sort of like if the pandemic, swung all the way to the concerned, now what we're going to see is a little less sort of even, in not huge spikes. We're going to see these sort of moderate spikes and maybe these blips along the way. And I think as a marketer, what that means is you have to look for trends, and you have to be really in tune to these and this is why search data, and we show this search data is often an early indicator of where these things can go. And we'll talk a little bit later how you might be able to market off those trends and capitalize on them as well. So what, now what, right? So we unpacked some of these core themes, and I think some of them you'll find are really challenging ones to deal with, especially the supply ones. And so what can you do about it? Well, what Troy and I wanted to do for this is as you think about digital shelf and you think about retail media, is to give you like a checklist. You know, at the end of this webinar, our hope is that you can look at this and say, hey, we're doing this, we're doing that, or we should be doing this, and just to help you think about how you bring these two things together. And so I'll cover off on some examples, but a couple of the 5 key things that I think are really important to think about from a digital shelf strategy as it stands right now for the products that are going to be your hero products in Q4 is, number 1 is get your Amazon product page up to snuff. And really there is a data-driven way to do that by looking at benchmarks and really trying to say, are my products up to what the best in class is? What do the best sellers look like? And that's number 1. The second is to look for that juice on the organic side. Aussie retail media and what Pacvue does is tremendous, but we also have some opportunities to get efficiencies and get additional benefits by looking at what we can optimize. And that isn't just for Amazon. Increasingly, there's more opportunity to optimize organically for Walmart and Target, and there's still a huge room to be leaders in that space, whereas on Amazon's a little tougher. So that's like the second element. The third is, it's related to content, but a little bit differently, is actually looking at your product images and spending the time to make sure that you are putting the right image out there. And there's some good case studies I'll share on how that can make a difference. And then the fourth is building a war room. So the question, as you look at these variables, supply being one, pricing, and even search, the dynamics of what that's moving is such that you really need to think about not so much planning is your skill, but how is responding your skill? That is going to be the make or break. It's how quickly you can react. And for that, you will need to hone in on some daily, like set up a daily alert system for those KPIs that are most actionable in the immediacy. And the fifth is having the right metrics in place. At the end of Q4, you're going to want to look back and say, what did we learn? And not having a plan in place now, you know, you want to get a plan in place now so that you have those metrics. We'll talk a little bit about what those metrics are. So when I talked about getting to benchmark, what I really mean is looking at bestsellers. Like if we're talking about Amazon, if you mine the data that's out there and you look at what's common about bestsellers in your category, you can then say that you see patterns, right? Bestsellers have certain numbers of videos, images, and they have A+ content. So the thing that you want to do is take a look at the portfolio that you're going to be promoting in any season, and this reverse engineer and say, where am I missing those things? Now, if you can get those things up to benchmark, what we've seen is a 60% sales lift on that. So if you're thinking about driving your ad dollars to these products, how about doing that on top of the 60% sales lift? And so this is really one of the first foundational things that you can do to get your shelf ready for this big onslaught of demand that you're going to have. And if it's been a while that you haven't looked at your category pages, it's a good time to take another look at that and see where you stand.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, Mike, I mean, you know, in the real crowded space of e-commerce, there seems like there's always a new retailer of importance. Amazon's always going to be the elephant in the room, but I think really the point that I want to drive home here is SEO and content across all retailers is, you know, basically algorithmically not the same, right? Even within this graph that we're looking at here, we can see that, you know, Walmart and Target, for example, they have different benchmarks. They're going to weigh these different attributes of your products and your product pages separately, not only across retailers, but even looking at specific product categories, right? I mean, this analysis was done for the toys category. While it won't vary too much, it's important to look at things within a very kind of granular and specific context here. Also, one thing we want to mention is benchmarks are what you want to shoot for, right? They shouldn't be kind of the holy grail here, but Profitero has definitely done a lot of the great analysis and legwork here to really give marketers and content writers what they need to kind of stand out and be up to par when it comes to retail readiness for an individual retailer. Especially in the case of Walmart, right? I mean, we're going to be talking about some of the retail media and advertising strategies here in a couple slides. But I think what we've seen, I mean, even I'll call out someone on the attendee list. It looks like Wes Ryan is on here. He actually let me know about this long ago before I even read this study from Profitero, is really the impact that SEO and content is going to have on a retailer like Walmart online, right? Given the fact that there's such less opportunity to win ad placements and ad inventory, especially in comparison to Amazon, where almost 50%, if not more, is probably dominated by ads. So this is going to be imperative to driving success on these retailers, even before you consider stacking it up with paid investment.
Yeah, and I think it's all about finding that leverage and being the first mover. Especially, we know this about Amazon. You think about the story of Amazon was being the first mover, and Amazon gives you a huge advantage, so that it's always incrementally harder for a new product or a new brand to hit because you have that history. And I think there's some run room on Walmart to be that mover in that space. And so to your point, there's so much more real estate to win organically. And what we recommend is, you look at a grid on the left. Not all things are created equal. I think one of the interesting things I've consistently seen with the Amazon analysis is how much reviews matter. This is almost in every category that we look at is, so you might want to say, well, we haven't thought about review syndication on Walmart. We really haven't thought about those strategies. There's an opportunity there. And then in terms of the benchmarks, with Amazon, the way the data works is they have bestseller metrics, and you can say, well, let me look at the bestsellers and let me pivot my content off that. With other retailers, they don't. And so what we recommend is that's where you want to look at SEO benchmarks. And so what we're showing you here is this is what's going to be common about the products that are showing up on page one. And that's probably a pretty good indicator that those are the top selling products. So, you can use the SEO benchmarks to help guide your content strategy on those retailers. And that's something that we recommend if you're looking for something, a North Star to shoot for. And then images. I talked about images. So what we've been talking about is what I'll call like getting the benchmark. Okay, that's great. But benchmark can still be, all right, now you're average. Great, congrats. How do you accelerate that? That's where images are really playing a huge role. And especially hero images and carousel images is the question you should be asking is, how do you know if you have the right imagery? How do you know if it's working hard? And this is where conversion really makes a difference. And so one of the things that is now available, if you think of the old days, you're making some qualitative guesses about what should I put here in this carousel. Like you go to your brand library and you're like, okay, these are the assets, I'll put those in there. But you don't really know if you can do better. And so there are new technologies out there, which Profitero has been using, a company called Visit that has an AI technology. And what they're able to do is they're able to scan your brand library and they're able to scan your competitors' product pages and tell you what kind of images are resonating best in that category. And then what you can then do with that is make swap outs and actually measure that with a tool like Profitero. So in this example, we had Master Lock, and Master Lock on the left had this image of a safe, as you can see it. And in their brand library, we found that this image on the right was actually resonating more with the AI, and the AI models what consumers react to. And so what we did is we swapped it out and we measured the impact on glance views and traffic on Amazon, conversion rate and sales. And we removed all the other variables. We saw pretty substantial sales gain. So again, it's like building on top of, think about what you're going to get from your lift on advertising and promotions. Now build that on top of this. And these are the types of things that you can really be thinking about doing now in the September and October lead up to holiday season. And then I talked about monitoring. Giving all these variables, there are a couple of things that we recommend that you do is setting up an alert system where you are tracking things that are changing on the digital shelf that have consequence. One of the things that we're seeing a ton of, and I'm sure you are, great, you built us awesome content. And then all of a sudden, somebody wins a buy box and changes that. And this is actually the example, is a real example of something that one of our client services teams surfaced for us. A client who sells face wash went into our app and discovered that the actual image showing was a machine gun. So this is something that you really need to have an alert system set up, and particularly in these dynamic seasons where you're going to have a lot of 3P activity potentially. You really want to know about these things like Toot Suite so that you can take action on it. And then there are other things that we recommend. One is competitor promotions and price drops, always very sensitive in terms of what you might be doing, especially if you're increasing your price. Your competitors might use that to their advantage and drop price. You want to know that that's happening. You want to monitor price swings on your own products, in any way that's going to be dramatically impacting demand. Products falling off of page one, that is, we found in our research that if a product falls off of page one, on average, you're losing about 30% of the sales volume. So if you're banking on a certain product, and obviously tools like Pacvue will help you here, but if you're banking on a product being a hero, then you got to make sure it's on page one. And if not, you need to know about that pretty quickly. And then the last thing is, often around the season, depending on your category, you're going to be launching some new products. And that's always a situation where you want to monitor for reviews, particularly new reviews, so that negative reviews, so you can catch those things in advance and feed them to your product team. Or most likely it's something to do with maybe confusion and you need to update your product content. So it's a little checklist of things that you should set up, and Profitero can help you with these things. And then the last tip for digital shelf is measuring success. At the end of all of this, and I think the pandemic was a great example where organically we all grew. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to answer to your management team. You want to be able to justify more budget. You need to say, did we outgrow? Did we win? And this is an example of an analysis we did for a client coming out of the pandemic, where you can see in the lower left, a lot of brands saw some great gains, but our client Califia and one of their competitors actually outgrew the category. And and this is just an example of the types of things you want to have a lens, not just in evaluating your performance on ROAS and day-to-day sales. But you want to look at market share as a particularly competitive indicator of success.
Amazing. Yeah, context is king, right, Mike?
That's right.
Alrighty, great. So now we'll be doing the same on the retail media side or advertising side to take you guys through a little bit of a preview of what we'll be diving into in more detail. In short, optimizing keywords is something that, of course, hopefully people are doing on a frequent basis, but definitely going to look at how it looks with Q4 and holiday season in mind. Number two, have a contingency plan again around out of stock, right? And not necessarily only your own products and product assortment, but out of stock is not a unique issue, right? This is something your competitors are going to be facing as well. So having a plan to take advantage of that is going to be key to winning in Q4. Number three, we'll be touching on some tips and tricks around not only budget fluidity, but flexibility with all these new retailers we've been talking about that you can take advantage of from an advertising standpoint. As well as additional channels as well. And number four, going to be looking at really where you can begin testing and learning. I mean, that's something that is hopefully always happening, but really over the next 4 weeks, kind of leading into Q4, this is really your opportunity to get those test and learns down. And lastly, taking advantage of sponsored display, DSP are two great examples of retargeting, right? With any kind of traffic surge that we're seeing, whether it's predicted or unpredictable, having these ad types in place to really take advantage shortly following that surge is going to also be a key strategy here. Just some dates to keep in mind. Of course, this isn't necessarily different from what we've expected or experienced in the past. One thing to note is, it's less than a month to go before the first deals need to be submitted, at least here in the US. Again, even though these dates are going to be consistent year over year, as we've been saying, for the last 30 minutes or so, everything's coming sooner, right? So just ensure that everything is in line, and hopefully you don't get caught too off guard. Mike, any particular call outs here on a timeline, or you would you say this is pretty consistent in terms of what we typically expect from an Amazon lens?
Yeah, no, it sounds pretty consistent in terms of like, getting things out early. I just think what's interesting is just like playing this off the data that we saw. There's the Amazon timelines, and then there's the marketing timelines or the demand timelines. So, I think that, like we're seeing is that early starting to investigate things. So what will be interesting to see is just how pulled up the season's going to be versus last year. And, I think that's more on the marketing and the top of the funnel. Might be different than the operational funnel.
Fortunately, not as aligned. Alrighty, so when it comes to building brand awareness, as I mentioned, we have about 5 weeks to go until Q4 officially kicks off. So really now is the time to begin building relevancy, right? And as Mike mentioned, I know it's hard not to get hyper focused or analyzed around, efficiency metrics such as ROAS and ACoS, but if we want to look for what's kind of going to lead to the most conversions down the line, really building that upper funnel, think about optimizing toward different metrics. Right? We touched on market share, we touched on share of voice a bit, but even thinking about like click-through rate as an example, that can be a great KPI to indicate what the relevant keywords are to not only begin increasing from a paid standpoint, but also begin applying those to some of your SEO tactics as well, right? So really driving awareness not only from kind of lower funnel, but also thinking top of funnel, right? DSP, sponsored display, when we're talking about Amazon, of course, this can be applicable to other channels, but really begin driving or growing, I should say, your audience. And this will be crucial to taking advantage of some of the retargeting capabilities or strategies that we'll be highlighting here in the next couple slides as well. Alrighty, and last year I'd say it was somewhat predictive, but I think now we can certainly say that out of stock items will not be as much as a surprise. So one thing to note here, as we see on this slide, for better or worse, Amazon offers a lot of opportunity to target at the product detail page, right? So this is kind of twofold. On one hand side, you could think about what this means for your own products, but as we mentioned earlier, thinking about conquesting as well. So on one hand side, if you're selling, let's say, if one of your products you're selling, a hero ASIN, something like that goes out of stock, you need to have the alerting functionality in place and the wherewithal to know that this is a good opportunity to begin shifting a portion of your budgets toward those tail ASINs, right? And also tracking share of voice. I know we keep on bringing this up. One of the ways that I think is pretty underutilized when it comes to share of voice is also continuing to monitor how your own competitors are bidding on their branded terms. This can be a great indication of potentially out-of-stock issues that they're beginning to face or that they foresee coming. And if they're lowering, let's say, spend on any branded terms, that can be, again, a great opportunity for you to come in and conquest some competitors at every stage of the purchasing cycle, right? So all in all, I think the point is here, have the right data and alerts in place to proactively push actionable insights your way. And I think Mike's going to share some other tactical examples when it comes to products going out of stock.
Yeah. So I like to use this phrase of like, there's the hunted and the hunter, right? And when you're out of stock, you're hunted. And I know everybody, it's really tough with what we're dealing with, where there's a lot of variables out of control, but your competitors are feeling the same thing, and there is more real estate. So we actually saw this play out pretty nicely around this time of Q4 last year, where we had basically a client who, let's say they're, in the dollhouse category, they're the competing against Barbie Dreamhouse. So imagine competing against Barbie Dreamhouse as a dollhouse, like how much money they spend on advertising, how much demand they get. But let's say you're the second or third player in that category. So one of the things that they started to do was they started to monitor using our data when Barbie Dreamhouse was going out of stock, and they gave that as direction for their bidding strategy. And so they started to bid on they did sponsored ads, and they did product sponsored on product page against Barbie Dreamhouse for their own product. And in a very short period of time, they saw a massive increase in share page one against Barbie Dreamhouse, and also a pretty solid incremental week over week gain just in the short period that we were recording. So this is an under leveraged opportunity. To Troy's point, it's really about how to operationalize that. If you have digital shelf data, you're going to be able to get this competitive intel. It's just a matter of how you can feed that, into the teams on your side doing it. Or if you have, if you work with Pacvue and Profitero, there's an opportunity to do this like in a partnership way. But the recommendation that I would have for you as you're thinking of doing this is, think about, you want to look at your competitors that are in the same average selling price band, set them up, and then start to look at when they're out of stock. And those are going to be the opportunities that you're going to get. And you're going to see new opportunities almost every week throughout the season. And it really, starting now, this is not something that you have to wait to do. Just try starting it now, do it as a test and learn. And if you think it's worth the while, then the question is just scaling it and making sure you have the budget to do it. So this is a good example of using the time period now to build the budget and getting that budget fluidity that Troy is going to talk about by doing some test and learns right now in real time.
Exactly. So really preparing for, I think budget fluidity is one thing, but flexibility is another way to say it, which is always easier said than done. So a couple kind of quick basics here. When it comes to day parting, right, I'm sure we all know what it is. Essentially, we want to ensure that our ads are being served to the right consumers at the most likely time for them to buy. So one thing to note here is, kind of the e-commerce golden hour that we're seeing is still consistently between 6 and 9 p.m. That's where we typically see the highest conversions. However, one thing about day parting is, I think some people can be a little bit apprehensive toward it because they see it as going completely dark during times of the day, and then trying to, really take advantage of, for example, the 6 to 9 p.m. period. That's really not what it's about. It's about utilizing the data you have at hand to have your dollars go farther, right? So not necessarily going entirely dark during inefficient times of the day, but try and, let's say, programmatically lower your bids and then increase them based on the ebbs and flows of not only traffic to the website, but where we see more conversions. And that can be used looking at the category or even looking at some of your own hourly order data. Next being, when you're reviewing performance, I think it's important to look at it within the appropriate context. If you haven't noticed by now, CPCs are continuing to rise, and they're probably going to continue heading in that trajectory. So I think the point that we really want to drive here is don't use year over year as the end all be all. Really look at performance when it comes to not only return, but also from a budget standpoint in the appropriate context. We touched on this a little bit on the keyword side as well, but ensure you're monitoring, really which keywords are ranking and not ranking well organically, right? It's important to kind of shift budgets toward those that are lower ranked to really improve relevancy in some of those gaps. And lastly, this is probably, the one that's the easiest said, but hardest to do. Have approvals ready so that you can easily sign off on extra inventory and or budget if the demand exceeds expectations as we're expecting it to do. Alrighty, and then of course on the test and learn side, right? I think the story is really always the same. The reason we want to mention this is because now is really the time to be doing a lot of your testing and learning, really before it's too late, right? So on one hand side, when you think of Amazon, if you're not already doing so, you should be investing in some of the new product types, right? When you think of sponsored display product targeting, sponsored brand video are some of the examples here, but also kind of optimizing different attributes around these ads. So even on a DSP side, looking at, let's say, A, B, C, D, E, F, G testing when it comes to creatives, audience, right? The list can really kind of go on. We definitely have some examples on the Pacvue website around kind of a deeper analysis of day parting if you're really looking to get truer understanding of what it specifically means within your product category. And then also, retargeting here. And I think really on the next slide, we'll kind of expand on this a little bit more. But to bring it back to the original point, broadening your top of funnel audience is really going to pay dividends in the long term. And I think that sometimes gets lost when we're so used to just looking at return on ad spend. especially for, DSP, which for some advertisers is a bit of a newer channel. ROAS can't always be, the end all be all determination of success there. The ability to grow that audience, again, following some of these increases in traffic, it's really going to allow you to retarget these consumers along the way. And another thing around retargeting is, you should also be having an understanding of which products within your assortment are appropriate for retargeting. I think one thing that we've seen is ASINs or SKUs with a higher average selling price are really going to be the ones that you want to, let's say, use sponsored display retargeting on. And the reason being is what we consistently seen is there's going to be a higher cart abandonment rate, right? The product consideration, the shopping cycle is always going to be longer for those type of ASINs and price points. So just be aware of how you're using retargeting. Don't think about it as so black and white. Really just have an understanding of which products are going to be appropriate. And then, of course, in this example that we have here, think about not only your own products that complement each other, but thinking about competitors, right? A laptop and a mouse is a very easy example, but I think what we're going to share here on the next slide is how we can get a little bit creative with, I'd say, complementary targeting as well.
Yeah, so this is a great example of where you can start to look at, if you look at search trends, right, you can start to find patterns and underserved needs. So if you remember this graphic we showed earlier, we started to see signs of like, okay, people want to come back and they're thinking about things. So let's imagine, all right, a really good example is, well, there seems to be this close relationship between looking, taking care of your pet, right? So if you're selling a technology, let's say, that is really about monitoring pets, there's an opportunity to lean into other pet products, right? Because it's really about knowing that your customers starting to think about these problems as they're going through these stages. People are thinking about going back to work, or they will be going about to work. And how do you create these sort of bundled packages so you can use these as understanding needs? So where are there complementary relationships between things? Food is another good example, right? So suddenly, if people are going out and they're on the go, you could find synergies between those products or particular products maybe in your portfolio that have this relationship, to know that people might be looking for, I don't know, we saw some things on like noise cancellation headphones, right? So that means people maybe are getting out, they're commuting, right? So what does that mean? Well, they're going back to work. They need things on the go. They need power banks, right? There's these relationships. And one of the things that we do here at Profitero is we take the search data a lot on our own. We sort of map it out, and it's almost like creating a narrative. Like what is this holistic need? And you can do the same. And that's why getting that to your marketing team can help in two areas. One, it helps them think about not just where you can do the retargeting, but maybe that's the time to start to do that top of funnel social media. Maybe you want to test some messaging out there in the top of the funnel in social commerce to drive some of these need states. Or perhaps there's like a bundling thing you could do. If you have complementary products in your portfolio, maybe there's a way to bundle that under a solution, or maybe there's even like a partnership opportunity that you could be doing in the season with another partner to really maximize your marketing thing. So again, this is the perfect time to start to gather early data, form some hypotheses, and at least have time to bake it into your plan, whether it's baking it into your test and learn plan or building it into your full scale effort. These are the kinds of things you can get out of the search data.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, the point being, before we get onto the retail media checklist here to end, is when it comes to the hybrid model, right, it's going to just differ so much on that type of consumer. So I think really the point we're trying to provide in that last slide is try and think of that collective storytelling. Where are things complementary, whether they seem obvious or not? I think, one example that comes to mind for me, these teams probably don't get enough shine when you talk about executing coupons or promotional strategies or affiliate, right? Point being, we haven't really touched on them today, but I can even think of myself, right? I am an avid consumer of HelloFresh, which is entirely due to the pandemic, right? And within each of those boxes, I typically get a slip of coupons, right? And to be honest, some of those aren't usually the most relevant for me, but taking your point around maybe not something as high priced as noise canceling headphones, but if HelloFresh or a company such as that or a service such as that is going to indicate that, hey, maybe this is a consumer that, is kind of working from home, is more of that, COVID conscious consumer, you can think about advertising toward them in creative ways, right? It doesn't have to be always within digital and in-store, as we've kind of been touching on today.
It's almost like a new segmentation strategy if you think about it, right? It'd be the way you used to segment your customer base was probably entirely different. Suddenly there's a life event, which creates another segmentation, and the very attitudes of how they think about this recovery can inform now suddenly a whole different set of looking and thinking about them and how you want to message with them.
Exactly. Well, thank you, everybody. We're going to open it up to a quick poll and then a Q&A here in a second. We'll definitely be providing the slides, as I mentioned, so you'll have the retail media checklist handy. But yeah, if everyone could take a second and fill out the poll, that'd be amazing. And then we'll open it up to some quick Q&A and get you all back to your wonderfully busy days.
Yeah, and I have a question that came in, and I can answer it live, but someone asked about earlier, I was showing some data around conversion and sales. So just to clarify that, the question is, what's the difference between conversion and sales? So what I meant is conversion rate. So like in Amazon, there's glance views, and then there's conversion rate, which is the percentage of people that looked at your page that then bought. So you can create the conversion rate, and that can obviously be a leading indicator of whether whether you really optimize a piece of content or you've optimized a campaign versus sales, which is going to be sales. So that's what I meant by conversion rate.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. We'll stay on for a couple minutes here just to see if anyone has some last minute questions that we're happy to answer live. Otherwise, you have our contact information there. Feel free to reach out if you're looking for kind of a more personalized demo or discussion around some of the things that we covered today. It doesn't look like we have too many questions coming in today. So, with that, spoke too soon. I appreciate the comment, Allison. Yeah, so as long as there aren't any questions, really just want to thank everyone. And of course, Mike, I really appreciate you being my co-host here today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, sounds good. And if anybody wants to connect, LinkedIn is the best way to connect with me. And I always enjoy collaborating with you, Troy. Thank you very much.